So Fraser Scott, like I say, is CEO of Energy Advice Scotland. He will be talking about the scale of fuel poverty in Scotland in the face of the rising energy costs and possible solutions. So I'll pass over to yourself, Fraser.
That's great. Thank you. Thank you so much. And good evening, everyone. I'm going to share my screen because it's a good distraction from looking at me at any particular point, I always think. So I guess I'm just sort of getting things started. Energy Action Scotland, we've been around for about 40 years, which in itself is a bit of a shame because like in 40 years, we've not managed to make significant progress on fuel poverty. But we're a campaigning charity with other charities at our heart. We're a membership organisation, quite a broad church, but at our very core are not-for-profit advice organisations working with some of the most vulnerable people in Scotland, as well as a broader supporters group, including energy companies, energy networks, installers of insulation measures, academics and individuals. So we've got a very broad church. And for me, I think one of the key things is pre-pandemic, you know, we do remember it, pre-pandemic, 1 in 4 households were already in fuel poverty before the crisis of costs that we're now facing for our energy. And at that point, that's like over 600,000 households who at that point were deemed to be in fuel poverty. And obviously, as things have changed, as prices have risen, and as incomes are in real terms falling, and inflation rising, those figures are changing. And that hundreds of thousands of additional households are now in fuel poverty. And some of the most vulnerable low-income households in Scotland are facing unaffordable energy costs and therefore are likely to simply go without. So my only motivation is to review the situation that we're in now and work out what's best to support vulnerable, low-income, fuel-poor households in Scotland. So what's changed in the last year is we've seen energy companies simply go bust, unable to turn a profit, unable to support their customers, costs adding to our bills every year, and rising energy costs, rising at a rate that none of us have perhaps ever experienced in our lifetime. And, you know, we're looking at bills that are almost 100% higher than they were just over a year ago, and they look set to increase even further. But what's fuel poverty? It's not just another kind of poverty. I mean, I hear that from time to time, is that it's just like other forms of poverty. But it isn't. Whilst it may share many of the same characteristics in terms of who's affected by it, it isn't exactly the same. It's driven by 4 different factors. And the thing that we're striving to do is to remove costs from people. Yes, household incomes are an issue. Yes, the efficiency of homes are an issue. Yes, how we use energy and what equipment we have in our homes is, of course, an issue. All of those things together, and right now, energy prices are the single biggest influence over the number of households who are in fuel poverty because of how it's calculated within a definition that we use in Scotland that is in legislation. So energy costs in themselves, you know, around used to be about 50%, but it's now higher than that of the cost of a bill is to do with the wholesale prices of gas and electricity. But the rest of it's made up of other things. The rest of the bill is made up of a mixture of things like network costs for upgrading and transforming our systems, supplier costs, including profits that they are regulated and enabled to make, VAT, and a whole pile of government, social and climate-related levies that are baked into our energy bills. And for me, many of these costs contribute to fuel poverty when they shouldn't. The levies that are in energy bills are largely regressive. It isn't the right place for them. We do need them. We need the income. We need it to exist. We need it to be there available to help transform our system. But they're regressive when they're put into energy bills because they inherently impact unfairly on those with the lowest incomes. It's not about people's ability to pay. It's simply a levy universally applied into everyone's bills and therefore plays a huge part in the fuel poverty of some of the lowest income households in the land, and indeed supports activities which none of those households are likely to directly benefit. They may receive societal benefits from EV infrastructure, but the lowest income households in the land have the lowest levels of access to personal vehicles, and yet are being tasked with paying for infrastructure which they themselves will not directly benefit from. But we need that infrastructure to exist. That's why we believe it should be in general taxation away from energy bills. So these hit the poorest the hardest, proportionately. The fairest place, general taxation, always. This is what's happening to our energy bills. I never used to say this is what's happening to all of our energy bills, because this is what used to happen only to people who are on the default variable standard rates, which were capped. Now that's just about every single one of us. There are some very, very fortunate people who happen to have been tied into longer term deals who, you know, I think they are indeed very fortunate at this time that their energy costs will be lower, but they are by far and away the minority. The vast majority of all consumers of electricity or gas are on the capped rates. And this is what's happened to them over the last few years. You can see they've bumped along. And then here we are, summer 2021, winter 2021-22, summer 2022. And what we're expecting is that come winter 22 into 23, we'll see a further increase on the prices that are already there, which will push us up to a point where we could be seeing something that's almost 200% higher than it was in 2019-20 for our average GB household that has gas and electricity. And that's just the average. Clearly, if you don't have the average mix, you'll be paying more, you'll be paying differently. Households on unregulated fuels will be paying much more than households on regulated fuels for their heat. And you know, the spread of costs is far from even across the country. And I will come to that in a minute. But yeah, we're looking ahead and you're thinking, what are the worst things that could happen here? Very cold winter. That's a really, really challenging situation that we could face. We've just seen one of the mildest winters we've had for a very long time, which has probably helped suppress many of the demands that may have been placed on advice and support services. But my God, they're already rushed off their feet. But anyway, we are simply seeing an ever marching increase in our costs, and it's ramping up fuel poverty. This is an old Scottish Government diagram. As you can see, this is a Scottish Government diagram which recognises that the single biggest influence that there is at this point in time on fuel poverty is just price. Because you can see that over that whole period on that diagram, the only times that it starts to drop is when the price drops, and it largely goes up as the prices go up. Now, that doesn't sound like a surprising conclusion to make, but what it does for me suggest is that we are not making any great strides on decoupling the relationship that exists between these two things, between the cost and the affordability of that for households. It is still simply tracking. We have not broken the back of this in order that households see some of these energy costs as more of a marginal, less material cost. Therefore, fuel poverty would begin to be eliminated if that were the case, because we'd be talking a completely different dimension to people's household income. But we haven't made any great strides on this front. Scottish Government has predicted that as of the 1st of April this year, as there is a 54% increase being applied to that standard rate, that there'll be a 43% increase in the number of households in fuel poverty. That will move us from 1 in 4 to 1 in 3. Scotland, we've got the highest rates of fuel poverty anywhere in the UK. That in itself maybe doesn't come as a surprise, but in a lot of ways, it's really still really disappointing. I mean, that's largely down to the quality of our properties, how hard to heat they are, partly to do with our climate, partly to do with how costs are applied, benefits that we don't receive in terms of, like, you know, proximity benefits to generation capacity. simply isn't. There is no relationship between communities in close proximity to renewable generation. It just simply doesn't exist. In fact, there are costs that we have to bear that are unfairly applied for connections and for levy, and the way in which costs are applied in terms of the network costs. We have higher network costs because our dispersed geography means that it's more expensive to service our populations than high density populations. I get that, but at the same time, it's not fair or equitable because there's no equivalent benefit to the massive renewable generation and those very same communities which are paying higher charges for their network. So 2022, we're seeing an increase, 43% increase in fuel poor households, 36% of all Scottish households. That's 874,000 households, not people, households that are fuel poor. And even more shockingly, it's almost 600,000 households who are deemed to be in extreme fuel poverty by the Scottish definition. That's households when all their housing costs and other things are taken into account are paying more than 20% of their household income on their energy costs, if they can afford it. And I say that because I don't believe that in some respects, a lot of this will be real because people will not be able to afford the energy in the first place. So they will simply consume less. And I think one of the things we'll see is that, yeah, there will be a reduction in domestic energy consumption, but it's no celebration that that's happening. This is the wrong kind of reduction in our energy consumption because what it isn't achieving are high levels of comfort conducive to the health and well-being of our people. In Scotland, around 2,600 people die extra in the winter months than the summer months. Now, the World Health Organization relates about 30% of all of these excess winter deaths directly to fuel poverty.
That's 10 minutes, Fraser.
Oh,
but
apologies.
Keep on going because it's all good stuff. Keep on going.
I'm going to say, so that's about 800 deaths a year directly related to fuel poverty, as was when our fuel poverty figures were bumping along at 25%, and now they're set to increase. Hospital admissions cost £8,000 per admission. Fuel poverty costs in the National Health Service are about 80 to 100 million a year, and that's set to increase. That's a lot of money in a system that isn't connected. We need to decouple. We need to break some of these relationships. We need to change things for the people. Put people at the heart. This is the distribution for fuel poverty based on those new figures. You can see that in the Western Isles, over half of all households are in fuel poverty. And many, many local authority areas, it's well over 40% in fuel poverty. We've got, I think the lowest we've got down there is about 19%. Yeah, that's a good performance. That's a pretty bad performance. Every one of these is bad. But it just shows you that distribution is far from even. Off-gas areas have the highest levels of fuel poverty. They've got some of the hardest to treat homes, and they face some of the highest charges in terms of like daily standing charges and other costs. This is a kind of makeup of the kind of households that will be in fuel poverty. And we have a definition, and this information comes through on an annual basis in arrears, a long way in arrears. And in fact, we won't even have any for the year that's passed. So the year of the pandemic, there will be no statistics on fuel poverty because there was no survey work completed. And it all seems a bit meaningless at this point in time, because in a year's time, we'll get told how many people were in fuel poverty, as reassuring as that will be for people. But it won't be, because they'll have endured it for a long time. And we'll have seen the impact of that in health and well-being and lives lost. It's even worse for prepayment meter households. This diagram from the Fuel Bank Foundation shows you why it's worse. Direct debit households can spread their costs, or their costs are normalised across 12 months. Prepayment meter customers do not have that. That's not how their arrangement works. And you can see in this diagram for the months of December, January and February that the difference between the cash flow requirement of a direct debit household and a prepayment meter household to achieve the same level of comfort is quite a gulf. £428 is what they would estimate a prepayment meter household would need to find against a direct debit household at £250 a month because of their normalised costs across 12 months. You can see what the impact of high prices can have on low-income, vulnerable people. They simply won't have £428. They're not saving it up at some earlier point in the year. They'll just have to go without. And the impact of that can be huge. I'm just about done. We've got a new fuel poverty strategy. We've got a heat and building strategy. There's a lot to like about what Scotland has in terms of a framework. But at the same time, we're in a very, very deep crisis that needs a crisis response. But it feels like we're a long way from seeing anything like that coming from governments. At the moment, the third sector, charities, not-for-profits, are picking up the pieces by supporting people who are in crisis. The services are stretched every day. And this is before we see the full impact of how terrible this will be for people this winter. We need to accelerate changes to the lives of people. We need to improve their homes. We need to see an acceleration on insulation measures to remove consumption whilst retaining comfort levels that help sustain the health and well-being of people. We need to see changes in the way that we pay for energy. We need to deflate some of the crisis that there is right now, and we are asking the Chancellor to remove VAT, because VAT is ramping in terms of not the proportion that it is within a bill, but the amount that it is. So by October, the UK Chancellor could well be taking an extra £100 off us all in VAT over our 2020 prices. That's a lot of money. It's still unclear what will happen with warm home discount, and a little bit still unclear in terms of the energy company obligation and the support that will bring to people's homes. But in real terms, all those supports are diminished because of the scale of the impact of price. £150 of warm home discount doesn't buy you anything like the same level of comfort that it once bought you 2 years ago. It's just not keeping pace with the crisis that we're in. We need to do much, much more. A pound of energy in 2019 is now like 63p. We are simply not keeping up. We're moving from £3.50 a day costs to £5.50 a day, and potentially £8 to £10 a day by the time we get to the winter of 22-23. So much is shifting. We're just not seeing a crisis response. And I think what we're hoping for is that, yes, we absolutely need to meet our net zero ambition, absolutely, but we need to do a lot right now to save lives this winter and to support people on a journey that helps them through all of this. It's a dreadful time, but thank you for your time, and apologies for running over.
So now I will welcome Ryan Morrison. Ryan, if you're there still on your train journey.
I want to talk a bit about this from a Friends of the Earth perspective, and also in the context of just transition. And I think what we've seen really is that the dramatic rises in the prices of oil and gas, which were shown on Fraser's slide with the graph of price rises in the context of wholesale price rises, that's largely driven by gas price rises, as well as the reduction in supplies as a result of the war in Ukraine, are demonstrating very actively the failings of our broken energy system. The social and environmental causes have underlined the case for a just transition to renewable sources of energy, but also have underlined the case for giving people power over the energy system. And I think it's important to talk a bit about how we ended up here in this situation. And it's important to stress that what's unfolding now is not squarely the result of the Russian invasion of Ukraine or any other one particular thing. This is the result of multiple decisions and policies taken by successive governments who have been largely influenced and shaped policy in the interests of businesses. The consequences of those decisions are now playing around us and have been playing out around us for years. We have an energy system that's incompatible with climate limits. As Fraser pointed out, where a quarter of homes in Scotland were already in fuel poverty, and energy companies who are largely disconnected from the people they ought to serve. The UK has big 6 energy company suppliers. They are deeply unpopular with consumers, as every consumer study shows, but people have little choice, and that's been the situation for a number of years. And let's also look back a year to when COP was a key headline for almost every politician and every media outlet. And again, our energy system was the spotlight. We were having conversations about licenses for oil and gas, which could never be consistent with averting climate breakdown. And yet there we had the UK government looking to press ahead with Campbell. COP brought scrutiny, and then the power and the efforts of thousands of people across the UK brought the real pressure, which ultimately forced the Scottish government to say stop Campbell, and also saw Shell walk away from the project, even if that's slightly changed now. We were talking about climate crisis then, and the decisions being made which will cause devastation. And this year, all eyes have turned to the cost of living crisis and the role of gas and the role of the rising gas prices have played in that. 85% in the homes in the UK are reliant on gas for heating. That didn't need to be the case had governments been quicker and bolder in energy efficiency programs and retrofitting with electrification of heat. I saw a graphic earlier today on Twitter that I meant to tag to be able to share with everyone today. It looked at types of housing and heating in Sweden and Finland, for instance, where the vast majority of homes use district heating networks and electric ground and air source heat pumps in relatively similar, or if even colder climates. And so what has been the reaction? Well, we've had the UK government energy strategy, and within that strategy, we've seen every long-term option possible being laid out on the table. The conversation is about nuclear, it's about new oil and gas licenses, it's about a small amount more offshore wind and very little to say on onshore wind, but without really anything to offer to people now. And that's really the vital part. This £200 loan system, as I think people are talking about in the chat, is just utterly insufficient. For the millions of people being pushed further into and also newly into fuel poverty, it offers nothing that they need now. And for the millions of people facing extreme climate impacts, it presents a very real threat. What we've also seen is the oil and gas industry reacting, seeing an opportunity to make the case for more licensing, more investment, and more power for them in shaping energy in the UK. But what isn't there is really more important. There is no real talk of what will be done to address people's bills in the short term. There's no real talk about what will be done in even the medium term. And also what's completely absent is just transition policies. There's no conversation about what an energy transition will mean for people who work in oil and gas, or for people who live and depend on that industry, not just in Aberdeen or not just in Scotland, but in various parts of the UK. And I think one of the things that's really frustrating for probably everyone on this call is that I think we all feel pretty confident about what's needed. We can see the solutions. They appear to make sense, both from the perspective of climate change, but also from the perspective of the social crisis we're facing now. In the short term, that means supporting people to pay their bills, to prevent devastating poverty. And beyond that, it's looking at the energy system that we need in 2030 and 2040, beyond 2050. One that has resilience built into it, not one that takes us further towards climate breakdowns. So it needs to be shaped and aligned with our climate obligations. And at the same time, that has the benefit through electrification, through greater renewables, through energy efficiency, of reducing people's bills and reducing the demand that there is for energy already. I'm conscious that the internet might break again, so I might move kind of quite quickly through some of this stuff. Sorry, I'm hoping I can join in the discussion as well. So when we talk about some of these solutions, we are talking about massive programme of electrification of heating. We are talking about an expansion of public transport, and we are talking about building more renewable energy and storage capacity. Now, that isn't enough for people who will face these bills starting from this month and then getting worse again in October. So we do need to see something to try and rectify that social crisis. And it's not to say that this is straightforward, but we do know that these solutions have the benefit of being transformative for people and the planet. And I saw in the chat there's a bit of discussion about, we need to reduce energy demand, and maybe this is, cost rising could be a way of doing that. Like, I think it's really important we reflect on the fact that actually a lot of demand for energy in the UK isn't being driven by consumers at their wish. We have huge demand for energy within the petrochemicals industry, for instance. We have huge demand for energy in buildings because our energy efficiency standards aren't high enough. We have huge demand for energy because our towns and cities are built to suit private car use rather than for public transport options. These are structural issues that need to be tackled at a structural level by government, and they require investment and support to do it. I maybe want to close by talking a bit more about how we get that, how we can get there, because I think we are quite agreed on what maybe some of those solutions need to be. And what I'll do is I want to bring it back to the origins of just transition within the United States. Great. I'll go back a bit just to where just transition comes from as a concept within the US labour movement. This was a concept which, from workers working within nuclear industry, they were organising directly to say they didn't want to work in an industry that caused direct environmental harm to the planet, to the community around them, and they had the support of the community with them. That was the workers, their trade unions, and the communities and the environmentalists around them, who collectively organised. They came together to say there is an alternative to this. It should never be a choice between a job that is environmentally damaging or no job at all, and we have a plan for that. We need you to support us to deliver it. It was bottom up, not top down. And too often that radical approach is lost today. So we see a lot of talk about just transition from the Scottish Government, but it's very often about them convening from a top-down level, business, academics, economists and others, but not necessarily giving that priority to the workers that will be affected, to communities that will be affected, or frontlining what is necessary to stay within climate or environmental limits. And so when we look at just transition in the energy sector in this context, we must see the workers and those communities and the environmentalists building solutions together and working together to succeed. I was talking before about the scale and the pace of change. There's a fundamental rethink of how we travel, heat our homes, the products we rely on. And it fundamentally what it comes down to, and what I think is relevant for the title of this event, oil and gas costs in the world, what we are talking about presents a challenge to sectors like energy, where personal profit can be made from business as usual. People are profiting from millions of other people being pushed into poverty. People are profiting from careering towards climate breakdown. So what it's going to take is massive popular support and a willingness to build the campaign together that can win these types of transformative demands. A just transition prioritises the people who all rely on the energy they use, the jobs that pay their bills, and the planet that we share. And from our perspective, priority is on getting that transition right for people globally by doing our share of stopping climate breakdown, and domestically to challenge the power of those vested interests. And I quite hope in the discussion that we can talk a bit about how we do that, what we can do together, so that when these vested interests are having their role, trying to create their space, there is a far more powerful collective voice coming from elsewhere. Thanks very much.
She is the chair of Campaign Against Climate Change and Trade Union Group. She's also a long-standing environmental activist and trade unionist who's steeped in this stuff. And she's going to be talking about things from an employment perspective and a focus on trade unions creating change. So welcome, Suzanne, if you are there.
Yeah, thank you so much, Angela, and thanks for the invitation to speak tonight amongst friends and colleagues, some of whom I worked with in the mobilisations for COP26, and some of you are new, but it's a really pleasure to be with you. I feel like I need to set myself a challenge because I'm not on a train. I'm sat in my spare room. It feels too easy. I'm sure the challenge will come in terms of the questions that will be asked. So alongside the introduction that Angela has given me, I'm also the editor of a report published by the Campaign Against Climate Change, which I'll hold up a copy. It updates a report that we produced previously called A Million Climate Jobs. This one updating that basic concept that the climate and jobs are not actually mutually exclusive, that if we are to really tackle the climate crisis and the intersecting crises that others have spoken about, actually we can create many jobs. In fact, in order to do this, we would need to create many jobs. So tackling the climate emergency, if we're serious about it, is about building a workforce for the climate emergency and creating the kind of work which we need to make these huge transitions. I very much agree with the previous speakers, with Fraser and with Ryan, and the points they were making, and just pick just to pick up on a couple of the points that Ryan made in his presentation there, and indeed Fraser as well. I think the energy and cost of living crisis is extreme. I think it's kind of hard, I think, to underestimate the impact that this is going to have on people, as Fraser spoke about at the beginning. And I think we need to recognize it compounds. It's a very immediate crisis, but it compounds sort of 30 years of neoliberalism, of a neoliberal run economy in which increasingly there are low wages, there's precarious employment, there's overcrowding in homes, people living in housing conditions which are not appropriate for their needs, for their community. It's sort of decline in the infrastructure that supports good, safe housing, affordable housing, warm housing, etc., etc. I would also add that in response to the climate, the energy and the cost of living crisis, both government and employers are not responding in a way which will provide solutions, but in many ways are using the opportunity to push further the kind of restructuring of the economy to the benefit of the wealthy, to the 1%, to those who have already benefited enormously out of 30 years of neoliberalism. And I want to mention two things. In response to this crisis, the government have done many cruel things, but I think one of the cruelest things and most unnecessary things that they've done is to cut benefits in the context of this energy and cost of living crisis, to cut benefits by removing the uplift that people got during the pandemic. For those people on universal benefits, not everybody got that, and refuse to increase benefits in this. So to take money away from people, the most vulnerable in society, at a time when the cost of living crisis is greater than it has been, for a generation. It's just the cruelest and most unnecessary thing. The other thing I want to comment on is the P&O hire and refire actions that have taken place. Yes, there's been a lot of talk from the government about how wrong this is, but actually it is a government that has presided over that method of undermining working conditions, undermining pay, pensions, etc., becoming established and accepted, including in the energy sector. We talked with Bristol Gas. So all of this kind of really comes together in a bit of an offensive against working people at a time when actually obviously the circumstances are set to get a lot worse for people. So I think it does very much call on us to recognise how we've resisted these offensives before, and that's through action. It's through solidarity. It's through standing together as a trade union, as a labour movement, as wider climate movement, etc. In terms of the government response to the energy and cost of living crisis, I think further it builds on things that Ryan was saying earlier, but they're exploiting it, cynically exploiting it, to return to a homegrown fossil fuel agenda that in the kind of movement, the climate movement that was built up from the climate strikes onwards through to COP26, and prior to that in opposition to fracking, it was an agenda that the movement had managed to push back. Not as successful as we want to, but with some success. We don't have fracking in the UK up until this point. We were pushing back on new oil and gas. Cambo had been temporarily suspended, same in terms of the Cumbrian coal mine. Now, they are cynically exploiting this energy crisis to re-push back on that agenda. And that's a tragedy because it will not reduce energy costs. In fact, the dash for gas that Cameron and Osborne began 10 years ago, at a time where they could have turned their attention to really investment in renewable energy, was done so on the basis of reducing our energy costs. That's why we were supposed to push ahead for a dash for gas, to reduce our energy costs. And yet we're back in this situation. Fraser made the point, the really horrific potential increases in rises. There was no guarantee with a dash for gas that that's going to reduce energy costs, none whatsoever. But they're returning to that agenda now. So it's horrific in terms of it won't address our energy crisis, but also it's horrific because at a time when we have to address the climate crisis, it will accentuate a climate crisis, which the most recent IPCC report described as, we have a short window of opportunity. Let me just quickly find it here. Yes, Antonio Guterres, UN General Secretary, commented on the latest IPCC report. He said, "I've seen many scientific reports in my time, but nothing like this. Today's IPCC report is an atlas of human suffering and a damning indictment of failed leadership." An atlas of human suffering. Over 3 billion people impacted if we fail to take the action that we need to take now, not in the future, but now. Otherwise, we're not able to stay below any of those targets. So I think we have to unite in some way against this attempt to cynically exploit the circumstance to push a new fossil fuel agenda and to fail on the kind of things that do need to be done. Now, in the chat, people were talking about, Fraser and Ryan both talked about the need to reduce energy costs, literally to cut the cost of our energy bills. I would also add the need for a windfall tax on the big six energy companies. I very much agree on general taxation, but there's no reason why some of the profits that have been made should not be taken away and used for the kind of things that we do need to do. But I would also say that in some way, as a movement, we have to come together around some key demands that will impact on people and will push back against this cynical exploitation of the crisis, pushing us in the wrong direction. And I would suggest that certainly I would argue that one demand that we should come around is in terms of retrofit and insulating our homes, and to tackle fuel poverty and energy use in that way. So that would create warm homes, comfortable homes that Fraser was talking about earlier, but it will also reduce energy use and reduce fuel poverty in the right way. In addition to that, it would create many, 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 many jobs and local jobs. Someone in the chat put it would be very expensive. Yes, it would be expensive, but it's an expense that we need to pay, and that we can pay actually through various different mechanisms. Luke, I think, mentioned earlier in the chat, increase in taxation of the wage would go a good way to actually mobilizing a mass retrofit and insulation program, as well as creating many jobs. These would be highly skilled jobs, many of them, and would begin to tackle some of the key issues that we've spoken about. The second issue I would suggest is one that we come around, which is about investment in renewable energy, but also the demand for public ownership of our energy systems. These are public goods. It's not a system that should be one which essentially is just creating large profits for a small minority of people, but should be one geared to meeting the needs of people within society, and of course meeting the needs of our planet. I'll finish this last point from me, which is I do remember 2008 very, very clearly, coming out of a set of talks, COP26 talks, Copenhagen, very failure to address the climate crisis, and the 2008 banking crisis, in which simultaneously attention was turned away from the climate crisis, and at the same time the solutions to the banking crisis essentially did not reconfigure the system, and led to further inequalities developing in society. And I really, feel that we have to perhaps think about in what ways can we unite to avoid that same outcome at this very moment in time, and that we unite to fight as clearly as we can for the kind of things that can make a difference, and which also keep us focused on the urgent need to tackle the climate crisis. And I'll stop there, Angela.